The new episode of Children of Heroes brought us all the way to Totnes in Devon, where we talked to sisters Magdalena Luscombe and Nina Buckley, daughters of Colonel Václav Robert Bozděch.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father served at the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. Could you tell us more about him? When serving in France, his plane was shot down, and he found a little puppy.
He was shot down in no man's land.
Yeah.
And with his, the pilot, they came across a bombed out farmhouse. And in the farmhouse, they came across a tiny puppy. They were worried that the noise from the puppy would give them away to the Germans, so they had a choice. They either finish the poor puppy off so he didn't make a noise, or, like Dad did, put him inside his flying jacket and smuggled him out, and they managed to make their way back to the airbase without being caught. And from then on, the puppy was by Dad's side throughout the entire war and after.
And they became really friends together.
Inseparable.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think they flew some missions in England together.
Antis used to stow himself away on the Wellington bombers Dad used to fly in. He's a rear gunner. And Antis, unbeknown to them, would used to climb on board and stow himself away and fly on bombing missions over Germany. There was one incident, they didn't know Antis had come on board, and I think it was a mission over Bremen, and they had to fly at an altitude of 15,000 feet. So, of course, they needed oxygen masks. Antis didn't have an oxygen mask, so Dad, he felt a nudge on his elbow, and he looked down and saw Antis there panting. He couldn't get his breath. Dad, apparently, he took off his oxygen mask and started to share the oxygen with the dog. He took to it straight away, and throughout the whole of the mission, whilst they're flying at that height, they shared the mask. And there was one point where obviously they had intercoms, and the pilot said, Bozděch, you snoring, I can hear snoring. And he had to admit that the dog had stowed away, and he was having to share his oxygen.
The dog later received the highest British award for animals.
The Dicker Medal, the Animal VC.
Yes. By becoming the first foreign dog.
Yes,
the first foreign dog to have received it.
How was it for your father?
Oh, it was such a proud moment. Such a proud moment.
Yeah. And I think it was the escape, the final escape, that earned him really that award, because had it not been for the dog, they wouldn't have been able to cross the border into Germany safely. There was another group of Czechs who were leaving at exactly the same time, and they were picked out by searchlights, a machine gun down right in front of Dad and two other friends. It was the warning that Antis had made that made them stay low and stay low a bit longer. They had to cross a fast-flowing bit of water, and as the three of them were crossing, Dad had hold of Antis, and the water swept them all completely off their feet. And Dad got to the shore with Antis, and he realised to his horror the other two had not made it. And so he told Antis to search, and off Antis went, and he found first one, and because it was at night, led him back to Dad, and then he went off and found the other. So they were able to regroup.
They had to go over a very steep hill towards the German border, but once they got to the summit and they were coming down, they had to put Antis on guard duty. And unbeknown to them, there was a guard up there, and Antis pounced on this guard, pinned him to the ground. Dad and his comrades came running around the corner, saw them with this dog with,
He'd never
teeth
seen
in his
witness
face.
behaviour like that before.
No, this docile dog. So they gathered this guard up, tied him up, gagged him, tied him to a tree, and then managed to find their way down to the bottom of the garden.
Yeah. He also was able to dig out some bomb victims when he was stationed in Liverpool.
He wasn't even trained. Dad, he trained him as in, I suppose, any other dog owner would, teaching him to stay, to fetch. But he wasn't trained in rescuing people. But, in Liverpool, when Liverpool was bombed, I think Dad and his friends...
They'd been to the pub,
They'd gone to the pub, yes, and they were just walking home and the bombs fell. And these houses obviously were demolished and all the wardens were coming out, digging around in the rubble, and straight away Antis just took it on himself to find these people that were buried, and he rescued 4 people alive.
When this was published, first of all, one man and his dog, and with the help of a ghostwriter, and he had to have a ghostwriter because he had to keep his family safe in Czechoslovakia, because at this time, this was after the war that he wrote this, he had a young son and a wife still over in Prague, and his parents, who had been put into internment camps as well. This book was more his words. We had the original manuscript. It doesn't show the whole of the story, it's just the war years with Antis. But the film rights to this book was sold. They were going to make the film 20th Century Fox, but unfortunately it was at the same time as Cleopatra, Antony and Cleopatra was being made. And although they had a very good actor, William Holden, who's long gone now, he was going to play the part of Dad, they couldn't afford to produce the film because 20th Century Fox at that time almost went bankrupt.
I went to Bomber Command Centre in Lincoln. They had a dog show and it was called Friends of Antis, and we were invited along. Whilst looking through their little museum, we came across the book for sale and lots of cuddly Antises, and they've even got his name.
They need a medal.
And when I said, oh, gosh, there's Antis, and they wondered who I was, and I said, well, actually, I'm the daughter of Robert Václav Bozděch. And they were shocked because they said they do a talk of, people during Bomber Command, and Dad is featured in their talk. And so I was invited to go on one of the little talks and had a listen, and it was lovely.
After returning to Czechoslovakia, he started to work at the Ministry of Defense, and he was a good friend of Jan Masaryk.
Yes. Masaryk was a very good friend of Dad's. In fact, he was godfather to our dad's...
our half-brother.
Yes, our half-brother Jan. He was godfather, which was... well, obviously meant a lot to him. Masaryk warned Dad that he was on the purge list, and that he would have to escape because, well, you could just imagine what would happen. But Dad, he was close to him, and the fact that Masaryk, Dad was sure he was murdered.
So he was adamant he was murdered, and he could say how. And unfortunately, there's never ever been any concrete evidence, and the Russians wouldn't admit to it. Dad's written it. He wouldn't have made something like that up.
And after the communist school, he escaped to Germany.
Yes.
And from Germany to England.
Yes. He did eventually, yes, with the help of Antis.
What did your father do after he returned?
Yeah, he stayed with the RAF and then retired, and then came down here.
Dad, whilst he was in Czechoslovakia, he was married to Tatiana, and they had the son. But of course, as he had to escape, he wanted them to follow.
Yeah.
And it never happened. He never saw his wife or child again because he wasn't allowed back. Yeah. And
he tried desperately to go back. He never lost citizenship, and he applied for a visa so that he could go back, and he wanted to see his parents' graves because they'd both died whilst he was in this country, and of course see Tatiana, who he had been forced to divorce him. And son who he kept in contact with Jan, and I vaguely remember parcels going off to Jan, vaguely, because there's quite an age difference. But he was declined a visa when he had applied, and I found a copy of a letter he wrote to the ambassador of the Czechoslovakia, saying, please look favourably.
When was it?
1974 or 75. I think it was 75 that he wrote again to say, please could I go and visit my family. It was declined, and it was declined simply because he was so high profile. He had written all these books, and obviously with his ties with Jan Masaryk, and he wrote radio scripts as well, and also published in a magazine, The Roslet. Yeah. And so he was well known, and I think that Jan and Tatiana were persecuted, as were his family, and so it was like the final thing, you're not coming back. Yeah. And so he couldn't go back. But we've been.
We traced Jan down.
Yeah, when I first found out about Jan, we were so young, and I still remember it. I still remember Dad saying to us that he had a wife and a child in Czechoslovakia, and I thought, whoa, I want to go over there and meet the family. And it took until 2004.
Yeah. How was the feeling?
It's quite overwhelming, isn't it?
Yes, it was, because we'd known of him for such a long time, and then finally there he was, and it was like, and you knew there was a connection as well. You could feel, he's my brother, and he was. I didn't know how he'd take us, because obviously we had had a lovely life. No persecution or anything, and he had not been able to get on properly at school, and then the army, it was limited until finally the Iron Curtain came down, and then he was able to progress.
Poor Tatiana, she couldn't even hold down a job, because she'd been at her job for so many months, and then they'd find out who she was married to, and then she'd lose her job. So all through Jan's life, his poor mum was just
because of Dad.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the guilt he held, he would have felt so guilty, and at the same time the loss, losing your family. I can understand why he was like he was, sort of quiet, very quiet.
And what about this church?
So this church, we got married here and christened here. Yeah. Dad's here. When he was in Czechoslovakia, he was known as Václav Robert Bozděch, and then in England decided that Václav was too difficult for the English, and so Robert came about.
Magdalena, you have dedicated your life to farming. What was the reason for you to choose this lifestyle?
It's funny, I always just felt a connection to farming. I just loved it, loved being in the countryside. I was 18, I joined the Young Farmers Club, and so I took part in everything that I could, from judging dairy cows to sheep shearing, welding, anything, ploughing. I won cups for ploughing.
And what do you prefer?
Latterly, what I do now, and that's rearing cattle, rearing calves. I've got a soft spot for the babies and feeding them and watching them grow. I hate it when we send them off to market. I worked in a bank. I worked in a bank for 20 years. That was boring.
And do you love horses?
Yes. Yes.
How many of them do you have?
I just have the two. I had a little pony for the grandchildren and the big horse.
And Nina, you have dedicated your life to caring about others, both young children and elderly people.
Yeah, from one extreme to the other. Down here, I was hairdressing, and I did that for 14 years. And I kind of got a bit bored in the end, and luckily for me, I met my husband, who was in the Navy, and he was based, he was down here for a few weeks, and he lives up in Hampshire. So I said, all right, okay, I'll move up there. And I was so desperate to get away. So I started my own little child-minding business, which I ran for 16 years, and loved every minute of it. I did fantastic things with them, taken them to the zoo and the local parks and things, and we just had fun. So I did that for 16 years. And then at the end of that, when my daughter was old enough and I wanted my house back to normal, I thought I've got to stay in caring. So I found myself a job caring in the community and visiting old people and looking after them, hearing their stories. I've heard such fantastic stories.
And the final question to both of you. How did your Czech roots influence your lives?
Oh, we've always grown up with this story of Dad. It's always been there, it's always been present. And the fact that we've got this extended family.
Yeah, I love
Czech
that
Republic.
fact.
It's wonderful.
Yes. It's funny because I've always felt really proud to be half Czech
Absolutely.
and half English. And when I go over there, I just absolutely love the country. Prague is my most favourite city on earth.
Yes, beautiful.
It's just got a really lovely feel.
Yeah.
I love the history. The architecture is just something else. It does really feel like we belong to two countries. When there's the Olympics or anything on the TV where we have the Czechs, it's like, I want them to win and not the English. It's really quite funny, but it's a lovely country, but with such a sad, sad past. Sad past.